Right now, 370 kilometers above you, there are people inside a metal shell who cannot see what is coming toward them. A hole the width of a pencil punched clean through a solar panel by a grain of sand travelling at 22,000 miles an hour. A knocking on the hull, like a wooden hammer on an iron bucket, that 3 separate crews have reported and nobody has ever explained. Something white and 6 feet long, moving like an eel, keeping pace with a space shuttle for hours while a surgeon watched and found no answer. 3 men behind the moon, hearing music, quietly deciding not to tell anyone, and the one you already know. I'm telling you there are other spacecraft out here, lined up on the crater edge. They're on the moon watching us. Tonight we count down 10 of them, and by the end you will know which of those sentences nobody ever said, and what the scariest thing an astronaut has actually said really was. Get comfortable. If you enjoy having your certainty about who to believe taken slowly apart, a quick like and subscribe helps this channel reach more curious minds like you, because the worst thing on tonight's list is not out there. Now let's gently drift into this. About 700 people have left the atmosphere. That is the whole number. Since the first human being was pushed above the air in 1961, roughly 700 men and women have gone up past the point where the sky stops being blue and starts being black, and have come back down again with something in their heads that the rest of us can only ever receive second-hand. 700 is fewer people than fill a large secondary school. It is fewer people than live on a single street in most cities. Everyone you have ever met, everyone you will ever meet, and every scientist whose work you have ever read about, with those 700 exceptions, has known space entirely through instruments. That is worth sitting with for a moment, because it is easy to forget how strange our situation is. We have mapped the surface of a moon of Saturn. We have weighed a black hole at the centre of our own galaxy to within a fraction of a percent. We have photographed a disk of gas falling into a hole in spacetime 55 million light-years away, and every single piece of that knowledge arrived here as light landing on a sensor, being converted into a number and being processed by people sitting in rooms with air in them. It is superb work. It is some of the finest reasoning our species has ever done. But it is not the same thing as having been there, and it never has been. 700 people have been there. And here is the part that makes tonight's list what it is. Those 700 were not chosen at random. They are, as a group, among the most carefully screened observers human beings have ever produced. Test pilots, flight surgeons, structural engineers, field geologists, selected in significant part for their tendency not to become excited when things go wrong, and then trained for years in environments deliberately built to make accurate reporting difficult. Put in centrifuges, put in altitude chambers, put in aircraft that fall out of the sky on purpose so that they can learn what their own perception does when it has nothing to hold on to. They were selected to be unflappable and then taught to be precise. They are, in the most literal sense the phrase allows, professional witnesses, which is exactly why the strange things they have said carry a weight that the same words would not carry coming from anyone else. If a person tells you they saw something they cannot explain, you weigh it against everything you know about that person. And when the person is a surgeon with 6 academic degrees who has flown 6 missions and performed the first spacewalk of an entire program, the weighing goes differently. It has to. So tonight we are going to go through 10 of them. 10 things that astronauts and cosmonauts have said, out loud, on record, from orbit or from the moon, or in the years afterward. Some of them were said over a live radio link. One was written down in a blog post by a man who had nearly died a few days earlier. One of them was never said at all, and finding out how that particular sentence came to exist is going to take us into a piece of radio physics that is genuinely one of my favourite things in this entire field. We are going to count down 10 to 1. And I want to be honest with you up front about how the ordering works, because it is not what you probably expect. They are not ordered by how strange they sound. If they were, the list would be front-loaded with lights and shapes and unexplained objects, and it would end somewhere very silly. They are ordered by something else. They are ordered by how much each one costs to sit with once you actually understand what was happening. Some of the quietest things on this list are the worst ones. The item at number 10 has no mystery in it whatsoever. Nobody disputes a word of it. It is pure engineering, and it is going to bother you more than several of the things that come after it. Because here is what I have found going through this material. The frightening part is almost never the part that sounds frightening. Almost every one of these accounts has an explanation waiting behind it, and in nearly every case the explanation is worse than the mystery was. The snake that followed a space shuttle around for hours has an answer. The answer means that everything ever released into orbit is still up there travelling alongside whatever released it. The knocking on the hull of a Chinese capsule has an answer. The answer is that the only structure keeping a man alive was flexing hard enough to make a noise, twice every 90 minutes, for the entire flight. And then there is the other thing, which took me longer to notice and which I have not been able to put down since. It runs underneath almost every item on this list, and it has nothing to do with physics at all. Over and over again, in two different space programs, on opposite sides of a Cold War, run by governments with nothing in common, the same thing happens. Somebody sees something, or hears something, or works out something, and then they have a conversation with themselves, or with the person floating next to them, about whether to say it out loud. Sometimes they decide not to. Sometimes they decide to fix the problem quietly and mention it later. Sometimes they report it, and it goes up the chain, and it stops. The observation exists, the channel for it does not. That is the thread I want you to hold as we go, because the item at number 1 is the place where that thread finishes, and it finishes badly. Number 1 has no unexplained lights in it. Nothing was misidentified. Nobody's senses failed them. Everybody involved knew exactly what was going to happen, in writing, in advance, and then it happened anyway, on schedule, in front of everyone. But we're a long way from there yet. We start somewhere much smaller. We start with a hole about the width of a pencil, in a solar panel, photographed by a Canadian in 2013, and with the sound it made on the way through. There is a photograph, taken in 2013, of a hole. It is not a dramatic photograph. It shows a section of a solar array on the International Space Station, gold and blue and geometric, and somewhere near the middle of the frame there is a small ragged puncture with a bright rim, about 1/4 of an inch across. The man who took it was Chris Hadfield, a Canadian test pilot who was at that point commanding the station, and the caption he wrote when he posted it publicly is the 10th item on tonight's list. Bullet hole, he wrote. A small stone from the universe went through our solar array. That is the whole statement. There is no mystery in it. Nobody has ever disputed it. Nobody has ever suggested it was something else, and no government has ever been accused of covering it up. It is a completely ordinary engineering observation, made by a man doing a completely ordinary inspection, and I have opened with it deliberately because I think it is going to sit with you longer than several of the things that come later. Here is why. The station is moving at 7.66 kilometers every second. That is about 17,150 miles an hour, roughly 27,500 kilometers an hour, and it is fast enough that the station crosses a country in about the time it takes to make a cup of tea. But the station's own speed is not the number that matters here. What matters is that everything else at that altitude is also moving at roughly that speed in a different direction. And when two objects moving at 17,000 miles an hour meet at an angle, the speed that counts is the speed of one relative to the other. The working figure that engineers use for these encounters is about 10 kilometers a second. Call it 22,000 miles an hour. Now do the arithmetic on what that means, because the arithmetic is the entire item. The energy carried by a moving object goes as 1/2 of its mass multiplied by its speed squared, and it is the squared that ruins everything. Double the speed, and you quadruple the energy. A single gram of material, about the mass of a paperclip arriving at 10 kilometers a second, is carrying somewhere in the region of 50,000 joules. That is comparable to a small car travelling at motorway speed, except that the car delivers its energy across the width of a car, and the paperclip delivers all of it into an area smaller than the head of a pin. At those speeds, materials stop behaving like materials. The pressure at the point of contact is so far beyond the strength of aluminium, or steel, or anything else we know how to make, that strength simply drops out of the equation. For a few microseconds, the impactor and the thing it hits both behave like fluids. Metal splashes. This is not a metaphor. Hypervelocity impact is studied on the ground in enormous light gas guns, which use a shock-compressed column of hydrogen to accelerate a small projectile to 7 or 8 kilometers a second, and even those barely reach orbital closing speeds, and what they produce looks like a stone dropped into a pond. The object that made Hadfield's hole was assessed by NASA as being somewhere between 1 and 2 millimeters across, 1 to 2 millimeters, a grain of coarse sand, and an object of that size is expected to strike somewhere on the station roughly every 6 months. Which raises the obvious question, If a grain of sand can punch through a solar panel, how is anybody still alive in there? The answer is one of the most elegant pieces of engineering in the history of spaceflight, and it works by refusing to do the obvious thing. You cannot armor against this. Making the wall thicker does not work because at these speeds thickness is just more material for the plasma to move through, and the mass penalty of launching it would be ruinous. So instead you use geometry. The pressurized modules of the station are wrapped in what is called a Whipple shield, after Fred Whipple, who proposed it in 1947. It is a thin sacrificial sheet, standing off from the real pressure wall by a gap of several centimeters, and the outer sheet is not there to stop the particle, it is there to destroy it. The particle hits the bumper, and both the particle and the section of bumper it hits are instantly vaporized, and what continues onward is no longer a dense, concentrated projectile, but an expanding cloud of plasma and fragments. By the time that cloud crosses the gap and reaches the actual wall, its energy is spread over an area hundreds of times larger, and the wall survives. A sheet of foil, held a few centimeters away from a wall, is better protection than the same mass of solid armor bolted to it. The most sophisticated shield we have for the most valuable structure in orbit is a thin skin and an empty gap. And now the part I actually wanted to get to, which is the sound. Hadfield has described, in interviews, hearing these impacts, an occasional sharp ping through the hull, and every instinct you have says that this should be impossible, because there is no sound in space. Sound is a pressure wave in a medium, and vacuum has no medium, and that is one of the first true things anybody ever learns about the universe. But the hull is not space. The hull is aluminium, and aluminium carries a compression wave at about 5,000 meters per second, roughly 15 times faster than air carries one. So when a grain of sand at 10 kilometers a second strikes the outer skin of a spacecraft, it does not make a sound in the vacuum, because it cannot. It makes a sound in the wall, and the wall runs all the way around the person inside it. Turn that over for a second. The astronaut is not listening to space through a window. The astronaut is sitting inside the instrument. The hull is a drum, and it is being struck from outside continuously by objects nobody can see coming, and the crew is inside the drum. Because they genuinely cannot see them coming. We track around 35 to 40,000 objects larger than 10 centimeters. We estimate something like 1 million objects between 1 and 10 centimeters, and above 1 millimeter, the size that actually made Hadfield's hole, the estimate runs past 100 million. Only the largest population is catalogued. The things large enough to destroy the station can be tracked and dodged, and the station does dodge them once or twice a year, and when the warning arrives too late, the crew shelters in the return vehicles. The things small enough to be invisible are the ones that actually arrive. Some of it is natural, actual small stones from the universe, as Hadfield said, left over from the formation of the solar system, but an increasing fraction of it is ours. In 2009, a defunct Russian satellite called Cosmos 2251 struck an active Iridium communications satellite, and that single collision produced roughly 2,300 trackable fragments, every one of which is now its own hazard. In 1978, Donald Kessler and Burton Corpallet described what happens if this continues past a certain density. Collisions generate fragments faster than the thin upper atmosphere can drag them down, and the population begins to sustain itself, and low orbit becomes progressively less usable for a very long time. And then there is Tim Peake's photograph from 2016, which I think about more than any of it. He photographed a chip in the window of the station's cupola, the big observation dome where crews go to look at the Earth. 7 millimeters across, spider-webbed, unmistakable. NASA assessed the cause as a fleck of paint, not a rock. A fleck of paint a few thousandths of a millimeter across, shed from some piece of hardware years earlier, which came around and took a bite out of the window that is standing between a human face and vacuum. None of this is new information either, which is the last thing that makes it sit badly. In 1983, the Space Shuttle Challenger came home from a 6-day flight with a crater 4 millimeters across in one of its windscreens, and when the analysts worked backward from the shape of it, they concluded the cause had been a flake of paint about 0.2 of a millimeter across. That single event drove a great deal of the early shielding program, and in 1990, a school bus-sized experiment called the Long Duration Exposure Facility was retrieved after 5 3/4 years drifting in orbit, and its surfaces carried more than 30,000 recorded impact features. That was our first proper census of the small particle population, and everything since has confirmed it, so that is number 10. No lights, no shapes, Nothing following anybody. Just a man photographing a hole in his own house and describing it accurately. And the reason it opens the list is that everything above it is at least arguably about perception, about what somebody thought they saw. This one is not. This one happened. It is still happening tonight, and the only warning anybody gets is a noise coming through the wall. Number 9 is where the perception problem starts, and it starts with a man on a spacewalk watching a line of lights that should not have been there. Picture a man at the end of a handrail, 370 kilometers above the South Atlantic at night. His name is Leroy Chiao. He's a chemical engineer with a doctorate, a veteran of 4 spaceflights, and at this moment, in early 2005, he is the commander of the International Space Station. He's outside in a Russian Orlan suit, installing navigation antennas on the hull, which is the sort of job that consists almost entirely of turning bolts very slowly, while wearing gloves you can barely bend. Below him the planet is dark. Beside him, facing the other direction and seeing nothing at all, is the cosmonaut Salizhan Sharipov. And then Chiao sees lights. Not one light. A set of them, 5 or so, arranged in a line that bends. He described it years later as looking almost like an upside-down check mark. They tracked past him, he watched them, and then they were gone, and he went back to the bolts, and he did not mention it on the loop, and he did not mention it for a very long time afterward. That is number 9, and I want to be clear about why it is on this list, because it is not on it for the reason you would assume. Chiao is not a believer. He has spoken publicly and at some length about this, and his position has been consistent and careful and slightly frustrating to everybody who has ever wanted to use him. He does not claim it was a craft. He does not claim it was anything. What he says, and what he has kept saying, is that he does not know what it was, that he saw it, and that he is not going to fill in the blank for anybody. He only discussed it publicly at all because an interviewer asked him a direct question, and he was not willing to lie about it. That restraint is the item. A man declining to say the interesting thing is a more useful data point than 100 people saying it. So what was it? The explanation that was offered to him, and which is almost certainly correct, is fishing boats. And I know how that sounds, and I want to defend it properly, because the fishing boats are genuinely one of the strangest facts about our planet as seen from above. Off the Argentine shelf in the South Atlantic and off the coast of Peru in the Pacific there is a fleet. It works at night, and it fishes for squid, and it catches them by lighting up. Each vessel carries banks of metal halide lamps rated in the tens of kilowatts, aimed down at the water, because squid are drawn to light. At times, the Argentine shelf fleet has run to more than 300 vessels operating at once, sitting just outside the 200-mile economic zone in international waters, in a long line following the edge of the continental shelf where the squid are. From orbit, that fleet is one of the brightest things human beings make. In the satellite composites that map the world's nighttime lights, it shows up as a chain of illumination sitting off the coast, in open ocean, with nothing behind it, in some years brighter than the cities on the shore. It is a floating city with no address, and it is arranged in a curved line because the shelf edge is a curve, which is the shape Chiao described. The lamps help too. Metal halide lamps emit strongly in the blue-green, somewhere around 500 to 550 nanometers, which happens to be exactly where the human eye is most sensitive in low light. That is the colour he reported. So the explanation fits the shape, the colour, the location, and the number. And Chiao has still never accepted it, and his reason is worth taking seriously. He says the lights appeared to be moving relative to the horizon, in a way that did not sit right with something fixed on the surface of the ocean, 200 miles below him. Here is where it gets genuinely difficult, and here is where this item stops being about lights and starts being about us. Judging distance in orbit is close to impossible, and the reason is structural rather than personal. Human beings have 2 ways of estimating range. The first is stereoscopic. Your 2 eyes are about 6 centimeters apart, and your brain compares the 2 images, and from the disparity it computes depth. That works beautifully out to arm's length, degrades quickly after that, and by about 10 meters it has essentially stopped contributing anything at all. Beyond 10 meters, everything you think you know about how far away something is comes from learned cues. Haze, perspective, known object sizes, the way distant things sit lower or higher in a scene, overlap where a near thing hides part of a far thing. Now take every one of those away. There is no haze in vacuum. There is no atmosphere between you and the object to soften it. There are no known objects because nothing out there is a familiar size. There is no ground plane to place things against, because you are not standing on anything, and the Earth is not below you in any direction your inner ear will accept. And the entire visual field is in motion, because you are travelling at 7.7 kilometers a second, so ground features sweep past continuously, and there is no fixed reference anywhere in the scene. Under those conditions, a light at 10 meters and a light at 370 kilometers subtend a different angle, but nothing else about them is different. There is no cue left that tells you which one you are looking at. Your rangefinder has been unplugged, and worse than that, it has not told you it has been unplugged. It carries on producing confident answers. There is one more layer, which is refraction. Near the limb of the Earth, light from surface sources passes through a long slanting path of atmosphere, and it bends by roughly half a degree, and it compresses and displaces the sources it comes from. A line of lights on the ocean, seen near the horizon, does not appear where it actually is. It appears lifted and squeezed, and it can appear to sit above the surface rather than on it. And there are two more distortions sitting between the observer and the scene that almost never get mentioned in these accounts. The first is the visor. An extravehicular helmet carries a gold coating over its outer shell, laid down at a thickness of about 500 thousandths of a millimeter, which exists to reflect infrared and keep the wearer from cooking in direct sunlight. Gold does that beautifully. It also alters the apparent colour of anything dim seen through it, which means the colour reported from a spacewalk has already been filtered before it reaches the eye. The second is that the astronaut is not looking at an empty sky. Every crewed vehicle is surrounded by a slow halo of its own shed material, ice crystals from the cooling system, flecks of insulation, drifting particles catching the sunlight, all of it hanging within a few meters of the helmet and all of it out of focus. Some of what crews report as distant objects has always been the local weather of their own spacecraft. It is also worth remembering how alone Chiao was, in a sense that has nothing to do with the 200 miles beneath him. Expedition 10 was flying during the long stand-down after the loss of Columbia, when the station was reduced to a caretaker crew of 2, holding the place open with a skeleton staff and no shuttle coming. 2 men, a very large empty structure, and months of it. Chiao's objection was about apparent motion, and apparent motion, when you're moving at 17,000 miles an hour with nothing to measure against, is precisely the quantity a human being is worst at judging, which means the disagreement between him and the explanation cannot be resolved from either side, and I think the honest thing is to leave it exactly there. But do not put down the general point too quickly, because it cuts in both directions, and this is the emotional weight of number 9. We usually deploy this kind of argument to explain away the alarming reports. He thought he saw a craft, but human depth perception fails in orbit, so it was probably a boat. Fine. Except the instrument does not know what it is being asked to measure. If your rangefinder is unreliable, it is unreliable for the reassuring answers too. Every calm identification, every it was just debris, every it was only ice off the vents, rests on exactly the same broken equipment as every alarming one. The most highly trained pair of eyes we can put into orbit could not tell whether a light was 10 meters away or 200 miles beneath him, and he was honest enough to say so. Number 8 is what happens when the thing you cannot range is not 200 miles below you. It is 6 feet long, and it is moving, and it is keeping pace with your spacecraft. Before I tell you what he saw, I want to tell you who he is, because in this case the credentials are not background. They are the entire argument. Franklin Story Musgrave left school early and joined the United States Marine Corps as an aviation electrician and instrument technician. He then went back and collected 6 academic degrees: mathematics and statistics, business, chemistry, medicine, physiology and biophysics, and, because apparently 5 was not enough, literature. He qualified as a surgeon, and he kept working shifts as a trauma surgeon part-time while employed as an astronaut, which is a sentence I've read several times and still find difficult. He flew 6 times. He is the only human being who has flown aboard all 5 space shuttle orbiters. In April of 1983, on the 6th shuttle flight, he performed the first spacewalk of the entire shuttle program, and 10 years later, in December of 1993, he was on the crew that went up to fix the Hubble Space Telescope, which had been launched with a mirror ground to the wrong shape and had spent 3 years being a very expensive embarrassment. That mission involved 5 spacewalks across 5 consecutive days, the most demanding servicing campaign ever attempted, and Musgrave spent more than 26 hours of it outside. This is the person you would design if you were asked to build a maximally reliable witness, trained observer, physician, physicist by any practical measure, emotionally flat under load by professional requirement, 6 flights of experience with what space actually looks like out of a window, and in interviews from the mid-1990s onward, he has described seeing a snake, his own words, and he has repeated them consistently for 30 years. On 2 of my missions, and I still do not have an answer, I have seen a snake out there 6, 7, or 8 feet long. It is rubbery because it has internal waves in it, and it follows you for a rather long period of time. Sit with the specificity of that for a moment. Not a light, not a glow, not a shape in the distance. Something white, several feet long, moving with waves travelling down its own length like an eel or a water snake, keeping station with the orbiter for an extended stretch of time while he watched it. On 2 separate missions, years apart. Now here is the thing about number 8 that makes it, for my money, the most quietly satisfying item on this list. There is an explanation. Musgrave himself supplies it, which is characteristic of him. He has said it may well have been a length of rubber seal shed from the vehicle, or something similar, and that explanation, once you follow it properly, is far more interesting than the mystery it replaces. Start with the question of why the thing follows you. If you drop something out of an airplane, it goes away. It falls behind, it falls below, it is gone in seconds, and every intuition you have about released objects comes from that experience. In orbit, none of it applies. If a piece of material detaches from a spacecraft with a relative speed of a few centimeters per second, it does not fall behind, because there is no behind for it to fall into. Both objects are already falling. That is what an orbit is. The spacecraft is not being held up by anything. It is falling around the planet and continuously missing, and the fragment that just came off it is doing exactly the same thing, at exactly the same speed, on exactly the same path. So it stays. A tiny relative velocity does not produce a departure. It produces a companion. The 2 drift apart at centimeters a minute, which over the course of an entire working day amounts to a few tens of meters, and unless something else intervenes, they will keep orbiting together for as long as their orbits last. The shuttle would open its payload bay doors in sunlight and be surrounded by a slow, glittering halo of its own shed skin, and that halo would still be there hours later, and the crews knew this, and it still unsettled them. That is the first mechanism. Here is the second, and this one I find genuinely lovely. Why does it writhe? Take a length of rubber cord on Earth, hold it at one end, flick it, and watch. A wave travels down it, reflects off the far end, comes back, and within a second or 2 the whole thing has gone still. That damping comes from 2 places. Some of it is internal friction inside the material, but most of it, for most objects, is the air. Every time the cord moves sideways, it has to push air out of the way, and pushing air radiates energy away as sound, and that is where the motion goes. Now remove the air. In vacuum there is no acoustic radiation. The only energy loss left is whatever internal friction the material has, and for a rubbery polymer at those temperatures that mechanism is slow. So a flexible strip that acquired a transverse wave when it detached does not settle. The wave keeps propagating down its length, reflecting off one end, travelling back, reflecting again for a very long time. The thing genuinely undulates. It is not an illusion. It is not a trick of the eye. It is a real standing wave in a real object that has almost nothing available to damp it. Strike a tuning fork in a vacuum chamber, and it rings for far longer than it does in a room, for exactly this reason. So what Musgrave saw, in all likelihood, was a strip of shed material travelling alongside his spacecraft, because that is what release material does, moving in slow undulations because vacuum will not let it stop moving. There are other candidates that behave the same way. Ice from the flash evaporator system forms long flocculent structures, and as they sublimate unevenly, the escaping vapour gives them tiny thrusts that make them tumble and twist. Beat a cloth from a thermal blanket, tape, any of it would do. Then there is the size, and the size is the part that never survives scrutiny in any of these accounts, including this one. 6 to 8 feet is not something Musgrave measured. It cannot be. It is an inference from an assumed distance, and it is subject to everything we established in the last part. An object 6 feet long at 50 feet away, and an object 6 inches long at 5 feet away subtend precisely the same angle at the eye, and in orbit there is no cue left that separates them. Musgrave knows this perfectly well, which is exactly why his account never leans on the number, and why he says 6, 7 or 8 feet rather than picking 1. And now the detail from the way this story usually gets told, which I want to turn around, because it is always deployed backwards, 2 out of 6 flights. He saw it on 2 of his 6 missions, and that is normally presented as the clincher. What are the odds? If it were a hallucination, how could it possibly happen twice? But run it the other way. If the cause is an exotic visitor, then 2 sightings across 6 flights is a genuinely bizarre coincidence requiring explanation. If the cause is routine vehicle shedding, then 2 out of 6 is not a coincidence at all. It is precisely what you would expect, because routine things recur. Vehicles shed material on most flights. Some of that material is long and flexible. Some of the time somebody happens to be looking out of the right window during the right orbit with the right lighting behind it. The frequency is evidence for the mundane explanation, not against it. And yet, I have to be honest and finish the item properly, because Musgrave has never closed it. He has the training to evaluate the SEAL explanation, he was the one who proposed it, and 30 years later he still says he does not have an answer. Nobody has ever matched the sighting to a specific piece of hardware on a specific flight. The spaceflight historian James Oberg, who has spent decades methodically working through astronaut anomaly reports and dismantling most of them, treats this one as among the more interesting open cases, and the reason he does is not the object. It is that Musgrave refuses to overclaim it. There is one more reason I trust the man on this. Musgrave has never traded on it. He has not built a career on the snake, has not written a book about it, has not appeared on a circuit selling it. It comes up when somebody asks, he describes exactly what he saw in the same words he used 30 years ago. He offers his own best guess at what it probably was, and then he stops talking. That is what a scientific witness looks like, and it is almost the opposite of what the genre usually gives us. So we leave it open. But we do not leave it empty, and here is the part I want you to carry forward. Everything ever released into orbit is still travelling with whatever released it. Every bolt, every strip of insulation, every flake of paint, every fragment of a satellite that was hit by another satellite. It does not go away, because there is nowhere for it to go. That is why Musgrave had a companion for hours, and it is exactly the same fact that made number 10 a permanent problem rather than a temporary one. Number 7 takes us back before any of this. Back to a young fighter pilot over West Germany in 1951, watching something pass overhead in formation. On the 15th of May, 1963, a man named Gordon Cooper climbed into a capsule called Faith 7, which had roughly the interior volume of the front seat of a small car, and stayed there for 34 hours. He was the last of the original Mercury 7 to fly, and the last American ever to go into space alone. 22 orbits, and on the 19th of those orbits, things began to come apart. A warning light told him the capsule was decelerating when it was not. Then the automatic stabilization and control system lost power entirely. Then carbon dioxide levels started climbing, in the cabin and inside his suit. He had no attitude reference and no automatic system to hold him steady, and if he came in at the wrong angle he would either skip off the atmosphere or burn. So he lined the capsule up by eye, against the horizon, through the window. He drew reference marks on the glass. He timed the retrofire burn on his wristwatch, and he flew a manual ballistic re-entry down to a splashdown 4 miles from the recovery carrier, which was closer than any automatic system had managed on any previous Mercury flight. His own account of that sequence is calmer than most people's account of a difficult parking maneuver. He had also famously fallen asleep on the launch pad during a hold before the flight. That is the man. Which is why what he spent the next 40 years saying carries the weight it does. Gordon Cooper believed he had seen craft that were not ours, and he said so publicly, repeatedly for decades, including in a formal letter to the United Nations in 1978. 2 claims sit at the centre of it. The first is 1951. Cooper is a young Air Force pilot flying F-86 Sabres with a fighter bomber wing over West Germany in the tense years after the war when everybody was watching everybody. And over a period of several days, he and other pilots in his unit watched groups of metallic disc-shaped objects passing over the base at very high altitude, moving in disciplined formation, higher and faster than their aircraft could climb to reach. He described it as an armada of them, flying in formation. Multiple pilots, multiple days. They tried to intercept and could not get near. The second is 1957, at Edwards Air Force Base in California, where Cooper was by then a project manager. He said a film crew he had assigned to photograph a landing gear test instead filmed a disc-shaped object descending over the dry lake bed, settling onto a tripod-like undercarriage and departing again. He said he handled the film, that it was collected by higher authority within hours, and that he never saw it again. Now, I have to do the honest part, and the honest part here is more interesting than either claim. The 1951 sightings have multiple witnesses and no instrumented record. Nothing was filmed, nothing was tracked, and no report has ever been matched to a specific file. That places them exactly where thousands of similar accounts from that era ended up. Between 1952 and 1969, the United States Air Force ran Project Blue Book, which examined 12,618 reports and closed 701 of them as unidentified, roughly 5.5%. Unidentified does not mean alien. It means the file was closed without a determination, usually because the information available was not sufficient to make one, and there is a candidate for that particular era of sighting which almost nobody knew about at the time because it was classified. The Skyhook program was flying enormous polyethylene research balloons at altitudes above 20 kilometers throughout exactly those years. At float altitude, some of them reached diameters over 30 meters. In sunlight, high above the aircraft, they look metallic. They drift in loose groups. They change apparent shape as they turn, and they are at an altitude a 1951 fighter simply cannot reach. Pilots who reported them were told nothing, because there was nothing they were cleared to be told. That does not resolve Cooper's sighting. It does mean that a pilot in 1951 had no way to resolve it either. It is worth pausing on what Blue Book actually was, because it is routinely described as a cover-up, and it was closer to the opposite. It was an under-resourced office staffed by a handful of people, receiving reports from across an entire continent, most of them arriving as a paragraph on a form weeks after the fact, with no photograph and no instrument trace. The overwhelming majority resolved to aircraft, balloons, planets, meteors, and, in one persistent cluster, the planet Venus, which is bright enough near the horizon to have launched a small industry of sightings. The project was reviewed by a University of Colorado study led by the physicist Edward Condon, which reported in 1968 and recommended that further investigation was unlikely to yield anything of scientific value, and the Air Force closed the file in December of 1969. 701 cases were left in the unresolved column, and they are still there, and they are not evidence of anything except that 701 times nobody could tell. I also want to address the phrase confirmed on radar, because it appears in almost every account of this kind, and it does far less work than people think. Radar is not a camera. It is an inference from a returned pulse, and the atmosphere routinely lies to it. A temperature inversion, where a layer of warm air sits above cooler air, will bend a radar beam downward and trap it, so that a return from a ship, or a hillside, or a flock of birds 100 miles away arrives back at the dish as though it came from something in the sky nearby. The phenomenon is called anomalous propagation. It is well characterized, and it produces targets that appear to accelerate to impossible speeds, sit motionless, and vanish. It is the single most common explanation for radar-confirmed sightings of this era, and it is what an operator in 1951 had no reliable way to rule out. The Edwards film has never surfaced. No corroborating documentation has been produced in nearly 70 years. Cooper repeated the account consistently and never varied it, which is worth something, and it remains uncorroborated, which is also worth something. And now the third story, which is the one that appears in almost every version of this list circulating on the internet and which I have to correct. The version goes like this. On his final orbit passing over Australia, Cooper saw a glowing green object approaching his capsule. The tracking station at Muchea, north of Perth, picked it up on radar and confirmed it. The media were then instructed not to question him about it. Cooper denied this, repeatedly and emphatically, for the rest of his life. He said he saw nothing unusual on that flight. The story was not his. The tracking station was real. Muchea was built for Project Mercury about 60 kilometers north of Perth. It went operational in March of 1961, and it was the station that handled the most famous exchanges of the entire Mercury program. But there is no Muchea radar record of an object near Faith 7, because there was no object, because the man in the capsule said there was not one. So what happened? What appears to have happened is that a legend attached itself to a man who was, separately and genuinely, a public advocate for the reality of unidentified craft. He had said true things about 1951. He had said unverifiable things about 1957. And so a third story which he had never told drifted into orbit around him and stuck there, because it fitted the shape of the person people had already decided he was. I find that more unsettling than either of the sightings, and it is why this item sits at number 7 rather than lower. We spend a great deal of energy asking whether astronauts are telling the truth. Here is a case where the astronaut told the truth, told it clearly, told it for 40 years, and it made absolutely no difference. His denial travelled nowhere. The story he denied travelled everywhere, and it will be repeated in a dozen videos this month, and in most of them his name will be attached to a sighting he spent his life disowning. We select the most reliable witnesses we can find. We put them through years of training designed to make their reporting precise. We send them to the one place almost nobody gets to go, and then, when they come back and tell us what happened, we quietly file that away and repeat whichever version we preferred. There is a coda to this that I cannot leave out, because it is the best illustration of the point. Everything genuinely strange that happened to Gordon Cooper in space happened in that final hour of Faith 7. A man alone in a failing capsule with rising carbon dioxide, no automatic control, a warning system lying to him, drawing lines on a window with a grease pencil, and timing his own return to Earth with a wristwatch. The carbon dioxide levels he was breathing by the end were high enough that cognitive impairment would ordinarily be expected. He reported no symptoms. The post-flight examination found none. That is a stranger story than a green light over Perth. It is on the record. It is not disputed by anybody, and nobody tells it. He flew once more. In August of 1965 he commanded Gemini 5 with Pete Conrad, 8 days in orbit, which was then the American endurance record and the first flight to run its primary power from fuel cells rather than batteries. 8 days in a cabin the size of the front of a car with another man, and the fuel cells failed early and had to be nursed for the rest of the mission. Then he never flew again, and he spent the following 4 decades being asked about lights. And there is one more piece of him worth having, because it is the most formal statement he ever made, and it is almost never quoted, while the fabricated Perth story is quoted constantly. In 1978, when a proposal came before the United Nations to establish a body to study unidentified aerial phenomena, Cooper wrote a letter in support of it. It is a careful document. It does not claim contact. It does not claim government conspiracy. It argues, essentially, that there is a real and persistent set of observations by credible people, that dismissing them without study is not scientific behaviour, and that the sensible response is to look properly rather than to laugh or to hide. Whatever you make of the man's conclusions, that is a defensible position, argued in his own words, on the record, under his own name. It is not what he is remembered for. Number 6 is the one where the astronaut was alone in a way none of the others were, and where the thing he could not identify was not out of the window. It was in the wall. On the 15th of October, 2003, a 38-year-old former fighter pilot named Yang Li Wei was strapped into a capsule at the Jiuquan launch site in the Gobi Desert, and became the first person from the world's most populous nation to leave the planet. He flew for 21 hours, 14 orbits, and he flew them completely alone. I want to hold on to that, because it is a specific kind of alone that only a handful of human beings have ever experienced, and Yang's version was the most extreme of them. Gordon Cooper was alone in Faith 7, but Cooper was the 6th American to fly and the 12th human being in space, and there was an entire accumulated body of experience behind him, telling him what normal felt like. Yang had none of that. He was the first of his people to go on a vehicle nobody from his program had ever ridden, and if something happened that nobody had described to him, there was no one in the capsule to ask whether it was supposed to happen. Somewhere in those 21 hours he started to hear a sound. His description, given publicly years afterward, is precise, and it is the reason this item is on the list. He said it was like someone knocking on the body of the spaceship. Then he made it worse by being specific. Like hitting an iron bucket, he said, with a wooden hammer, and then he said the sentence that has kept this story alive for 20 years. It seemed to come, he said, from neither outside the spacecraft nor inside it. He pressed his face to the porthole and looked. There was nothing to see. He did not report it in real time. 21 hours, alone, above a planet nobody from his country had ever been above, listening to something tap on the outside of the only thing keeping him alive. 2 details lift this above an anecdote. The first is that it happened again. Chinese crews aboard Shenzhou 6 in 2005 and Shenzhou 7 in 2008 reported hearing the same sound. So this is not one man's odd night. It is a reproducible phenomenon on a class of vehicle. The second detail is what Yang did afterward, and it is the single strongest piece of evidence that he was a good witness. Back on the ground, engineers tried to reproduce the sound and could not. They then played him candidate recordings, things they had generated that might match, and he refused to confirm any of them. He said none of them was exactly right. Think about what it would take to do that. He is a national hero, in a program with enormous political weight, and the sensible thing, the comfortable thing, the thing that closes the file and lets everybody move on, is to listen to one of those recordings and say, yes, that is it. Thank you. He did not. A person constructing a story would have taken the first offered match, because a match is what a story needs. He held out for accuracy against his own convenience, which is exactly what you want from a witness, and almost never what you get. And then he did something else. He told the crews who came after him that the sound was normal and that they should not worry about it, which is kind, and which is not, if you listen to it carefully, an explanation. So what is it? The leading answer is thermal stress, and once you see the numbers, it becomes very hard to look for anything else. A spacecraft in low orbit goes around the planet in about 90 minutes, which means it crosses from day into night and back again every 45 minutes or so. In sunlight, exposed surfaces climb toward and past 120 degrees Celsius. In shadow, they fall toward -100 and below. That is a swing of well over 200 degrees, applied twice per orbit, 16 times a day, unevenly, across a structure built from many different materials fastened together. And different materials expand at different rates. Aluminium expands roughly twice as much per degree as steel, and both expand far more than the composites and ceramics they are bolted to. So a joint between two of them cannot expand smoothly, because the two halves want to change size by different amounts, and they are physically prevented from doing so. What happens instead is that the joint binds. It holds. Strain energy accumulates in it, quietly, over minutes, as the temperature moves. And then, at some threshold, the friction gives way and the joint slips all at once. That releases a crack. It is mechanically identical to a knuckle popping, and it propagates through the structure as a compression wave. The phenomenon has a name. Engineers call it thermal snap, and it is not an exotic hypothesis. It is a documented and expensive engineering problem. The Hubble Space Telescope's original solar arrays did exactly this on every Terminator crossing, and the resulting jitter disturbed the telescope's pointing badly enough to degrade its science. The cause was traced to the array masts binding and slipping as they heated and cooled. It was serious enough that the arrays were replaced, so the spacecraft is being thermally hammered from outside 16 times a day for the entire mission. But the mechanism is only half the answer. The other half is the part Yang described that nobody could explain to him, and it is the best bit. Why did the sound come from neither outside nor inside? Human beings locate sound using differences between the two ears. A sound arriving from your left reaches your left ear a few hundred microseconds before your right, and slightly louder because your head is in the way. Your auditory system compares those two signals continuously, and from that comparison it constructs a direction. It is extraordinarily good at it. It is also, and this is the crucial point, the only method you have. Now consider what a thermal snap does. It does not originate at a surface. It originates inside the structure of the hull, and it radiates outward through the metal at around 5,000 meters per second, and it reaches every part of the shell essentially at once. The wave then couples into the cabin air from the whole surface of the cabin, simultaneously, from every direction. So there are no interaural differences. Both ears receive the same signal at the same instant at the same level. The comparison your brain is running returns nothing. And here is the thing. Your auditory system does not have an output that means direction unknown. It has to report something. So it reports a real sound, unmistakably present, arriving from nowhere in particular, which is not a hallucination and not a misperception. It is your hearing working perfectly and returning an answer that is genuinely undefined. Yang Liwei described the acoustics of his own situation correctly, in ordinary language, without knowing any of the physics. Neither outside nor inside is exactly right, and if that mechanism feels remote, it is happening around you right now. The ticking and settling noises an ordinary house makes at night, the ones that arrive from no particular direction, and always seem to be inside the wall rather than in the room, are the same physics at a gentler temperature. Timber and plaster and metal fixings, expanding and contracting at different rates as the building cools after sunset, binding at their joints and then slipping. Yang Liwei's spacecraft was doing what your house does. It was simply doing it across a 200-degree swing 16 times a day in a structure whose failure would kill him in seconds. There is a postscript to Yang's flight that did not become public for years, and it belongs here because it says something about how much of this gets told at the time. The ascent was much rougher than the broadcast suggested. He later described a vibration during the climb at around 8 cycles per second, low enough to resonate with the internal organs of the human body, which he found close to unbearable and which he thought at one point might kill him. Chinese engineers took that report seriously and redesigned the ascent profile so that Shenzhou 6 would not do it. He also landed hard, and the descent left him with a facial injury from a headset microphone, which was quietly attended to before the first public images were released. So the first flight of a national program presented to the world as a smooth triumph involved a man being shaken close to his limit on the way up, hearing something nobody could explain in orbit, and arriving back on the ground bleeding. Let me stop here for a moment, because we are halfway through, and there is a pattern forming that I want to make explicit before we go further. Look back at what we have actually covered. A hole in a solar panel, which is real and understood. A line of lights, which is probably a fishing fleet and cannot be resolved because human range-finding does not function in orbit. An undulating object, which is probably shed material behaving as vacuum requires. A formation of craft over Germany, which cannot be settled because nothing was recorded. And a knocking on a hull, which is almost certainly a structure flexing. 4 of those 5 explanations are not about space. They are about us. About the specific ways a nervous system that evolved on the floor of an atmosphere fails when you take away the atmosphere, the floor, the horizon, the haze, and the direction of down. Depth perception dies past 10 meters. Sound localization needs 2 ears receiving different signals. Both of those systems are exquisite instruments, and both of them assume conditions that orbit does not supply. And there is a physiological layer underneath that, which is only now being properly measured. Crews live on a 90-minute day, 16 sunrises, with no natural signal to entrain a circadian rhythm to, and they sleep badly for months. They breathe carbon dioxide at concentrations several times higher than any building on Earth would tolerate, because scrubbing it out completely is expensive. Without gravity to pull fluid downward, roughly 2 liters of it shifts upward into the chest and head and stays there, raising pressure behind the eyes. That last one has a name now. Spaceflight-associated neuroocular syndrome, characterized only in the last 15 years, in which the optic disc swells and the shape of the eyeball changes and vision measurably shifts in a substantial fraction of long-duration crew. Nobody has ever formally studied whether any of that alters the reliability of low-light visual reporting. The reason is simple, and it takes us right back to where we started tonight. The sample size is about 700 people, so that is the halfway position. Most of this is us, not them, which makes what comes next worse, not better. Because the next 2 items are the ones where nothing was misperceived at all. Both witnesses were entirely correct about what was happening to them. And in both cases what was happening was that a piece of extremely ordinary physics was quietly trying to kill them. But before we get to those, there is one more sound. 3 men, behind the moon, in the largest radio shadow any human being has ever occupied, listening to something that they all agreed sounded like music, and having a conversation about whether to tell anybody. In May of 1969, 2 months before the landing, 3 men flew the entire moon mission except the last 15 kilometers. Apollo 10 was a dress rehearsal, and it was one of the strangest assignments ever handed to a crew. Thomas Stafford and Eugene Cernan took the lunar module, which they had named Snoopy, down to about 15 kilometers above the lunar surface, close enough to see individual boulders, and then they came back up without landing. John Young stayed above them in the command module, which was called Charlie Brown. Snoopy had been deliberately short-fueled, and the reason given at the time and since is that if it had carried enough propellant to land, somebody might have been tempted. They went around the far side of the moon, which is where this item happens. Now I want to establish what the far side actually is, physically, before we get to what they heard, because the physics of the place is what makes the sound possible. The moon is 3,474 kilometers across, and it is a solid ball of rock, and rock is completely opaque to radio. So when a spacecraft passes behind it, the connection to Earth does not weaken. It stops. Every carrier, every telemetry stream, every voice loop, every ranging signal, all of it goes at once, and it stays gone for about 45 minutes of every 2-hour orbit. Mission Control could do nothing but watch a clock and wait for the reacquisition time. It was the source of the most acute anxiety in that room on every lunar mission, because if the engine burn on the far side went wrong, the first anyone on Earth would know about it was silence where a signal should have been. And for the crew, it meant something else. It meant they were sitting inside the largest radio shadow any human being has ever occupied. Every background hum, every faint carrier, every trace of the enormous, noisy electromagnetic environment that surrounds the Earth, all of it cut off by a wall of rock. The noise floor dropped away, and in the quiet they heard music. The recording exists. The exchange runs, in substance, like this. That music even sounds outer spacey, doesn't it? You hear that whistling sound? Yes. Whoo. Boy, that sure is weird music. We're going to have to find out about that. Nobody will believe us. Nobody will believe us. Then a long stretch of it continuing on and off for the better part of an hour, with them coming back to it. And then, near the end, the exchange that is actually the reason this sits at number 5. Should we tell them about it? I don't know. We ought to think about it. Let us do the sound first, because the sound is solved, and it is solved on the tape itself. John Young says it out loud. It is probably due to the VHF ranging. And he is right. Both spacecraft were transmitting on VHF radio, because they needed to know precisely how far apart they were in order to rendezvous, and radio ranging is how you measure that. 2 independent radio systems on nearby frequencies both live, both being received. When 2 signals at nearby frequencies arrive at the same receiver, something specific happens in the receiver's front end, which is not perfectly linear and never can be. The 2 frequencies mix, and the mixing produces new frequencies, including one at the difference between them. If that difference lands somewhere between about 20 and 20,000 cycles per second, then you hear it. And if the 2 vehicles are moving relative to one another, so that the frequencies drift slightly against each other, then the difference tone drifts too. It slides, it warbles, it does not hold a pitch. A drifting, unstructured, sliding whistle is precisely what a wandering beat note sounds like, and it is precisely what they described. This is not exotic physics. It is the most common artifact in all of radio, and you have almost certainly heard it. It is the same principle as 2 guitar strings tuned slightly apart, producing a slow wobble in the loudness of the note. It is why piano tuners can work by ear. It is what a theremin does deliberately. It is called heterodyning, and mixing 2 frequencies to obtain their difference is the operating principle of essentially every radio receiver built since Edwin Armstrong patented the superheterodyne in 1918, which means, in a sense, that the crew of Apollo 10 were listening to the architecture of their own equipment. There is a control experiment too, and it is almost too neat. Michael Collins heard the same whistling on Apollo 11 2 months later. He had been briefed on it beforehand because Apollo 10 had reported it after the fact and the engineers had worked out what it was, and Collins was not frightened by it in the slightest. He noted it, recognized it, and got on with his day. In his memoir, he makes the observation that if he had not been warned, it would have scared him. Same signal, same spacecraft, same place, different prior knowledge, completely different experience. I find that a genuinely useful thing to know about being a person. A great deal of what we experience as fear is not a property of the thing at all. It is the size of the gap between what is happening and what you were told to expect, and I do not want to leave Apollo 10 without saying what else that flight was, because it deserves better than being the mission that heard a noise. On the way home, coming down Earth's gravity well from the moon, Apollo 10 reached a speed of about 39,897 kilometers an hour, roughly 24,791 miles an hour. That is still, more than 50 years later, the fastest any human being has ever travelled. Nobody has beaten it. Nobody has come close to beating it. 3 men in 1969 hold the human speed record, and it looks likely to stand for a good while yet. The mission also produced the least composed moment in the entire Apollo audio archive. During the staging sequence, when Snoopy's descent stage was jettisoned, the vehicle went into a violent, uncommanded roll, spinning fast enough that the lunar surface was whipping through the window, and it took several seconds to arrest. Cernan's live, unedited reaction to that is the most famous profanity in the Apollo transcripts, and it is the correct reaction, and it is the only moment on this entire list where somebody says exactly what they are thinking at the instant they think it. And Snoopy itself is still out there. Its ascent stage was sent into a burn to fuel exhaustion and pushed out of lunar orbit into a heliocentric one, which makes it the only lunar module ascent stage that was neither crashed into the moon nor burned up in Earth's atmosphere. It is the sole survivor of its kind still going round the sun, and in 2019 an amateur astronomy project reported a candidate recovery of the object after decades of nobody knowing where it had gone, so the sound is finished. There is no residual mystery about the sound, and I'm not going to manufacture one for you. And the audio was never classified. The transcript has been publicly available since 1973. The recording drew a wave of attention in 2016 when a documentary series featured it, and a lot of the coverage at the time implied that something suppressed had just been released, which was not accurate. It had been sitting in the archive for 43 years, and nobody had bothered to listen. Which leaves the actual item, and the actual item is not the whistling. It is 12 seconds of conversation. Should we tell them about it? I don't know. We ought to think about it. 3 men, arguably 3 of the most composed human beings alive in 1969. Test pilots at the absolute peak of a profession that selects for not being rattled. 240,000 miles from home, on the far side of a rock, with no way to talk to anybody even if they wanted to. And the thing they are worried about is not the noise, it is the flight surgeon. They are worried about how it will look. They are worried that if they report hearing music, somebody on the ground will start asking questions about their psychological fitness, and those questions attach to a person permanently. And there is a landing in 2 months, and there are crew assignments after that, and the surest way to not be on one of them is to be the man who heard things. I have listened to that exchange a number of times, and what gets me is the pause. There is a moment in it where 3 professionals are visibly weighing a true observation against the professional cost of reporting it, in real time, in the most heavily documented vehicle ever flown, and they land on, let us think about it. Every institution you have ever worked inside is in that pause. You know this conversation. You have had this conversation. Something is not right and you are reasonably sure about it, and the person you would have to tell has the power to make your life difficult, and the observation is a little unusual, and being the person who raised it is a role you would carry afterward. And so you think about it, and often, thinking about it is where it ends. That is the pattern I flagged at the halfway mark, and it is going to run through everything remaining tonight. The observation exists, the channel for it does not. Here it cost nothing. The whistling was harmless, the explanation was mundane, and the worst outcome of the silence was a 43-year delay before anyone listened to a tape. The next 3 times we see this pattern, it costs considerably more. In the next part, it nearly costs a man his life in an airlock, and he solves it by keeping quiet and fixing it himself. In the part after that, it results in a spacesuit filling with water for the 2nd time in a week, and at number 1 it kills somebody, exactly on schedule, in front of people who had already written down what was going to happen. So, number 4, the 18th of March, 1965. A 30-year-old man leaves a spacecraft for the first time in the history of the species, and the Soviet Union broadcasts it live, and then somebody cuts the feed. On the 18th of March, 1965, a 30-year-old man named Alexei Leonov pushed himself out of an inflatable fabric tube attached to a spacecraft called Voskhod 2, and became the first human being to float free in space with nothing around him but a suit. He was outside for 12 minutes and 9 seconds. The Soviet Union broadcast the beginning of it live, to an audience across half the world, because it was the most spectacular thing anybody had ever done, and because it was a very good day for the Soviet Union. And then, partway through, the broadcast was cut. The feed simply ended. The official explanation at the time amounted to nothing at all, and the real reason was not fully described in public for something close to 30 years. Here is what was happening. The suit was called the Berkut, which means golden eagle, and it had been built quickly. Its critical weakness was that it had no proper restraint layer, no system of cables and internal geometry to hold its shape against the pressure inside it. Pressurized to roughly 40 kilopascals against absolute vacuum on the outside, it did what a flexible pressure vessel does. It inflated. His gloves stretched away from the ends of his fingers so that his hands were no longer inside them in any useful sense. His boots came away from his feet, and the joints of the suit stopped bending. He could not reach the camera control mounted on his own thigh. He could not bend at the waist. He had become a rigid, roughly man-shaped balloon, tethered to a spacecraft in front of a live television audience. And then he turned around to go back in and discovered that he no longer fitted through the airlock. I want to slow this down, because the physics is simple, and it is the reason the whole thing was inevitable rather than unlucky. A flexible container full of gas adopts the shape that gives it the most volume for the least surface area. That shape is a sphere. It is why a balloon is a balloon and not a cube. Now, a spacesuit is not a sphere. It is a set of cylinders, arms, legs, torso, joined at bending points. Pressurize those cylinders against vacuum and every single one of them wants to become a sphere, which in practice means every joint wants to straighten and stay straight. Bending a pressurized joint means reducing the volume enclosed at the bend. The gas inside resists that, with a force set by the pressure and the area. And 40 kilopascals across the palm of a glove, call it 100 square centimeters, works out at about 400 newtons. So closing your fist inside that glove is like closing it against a 40-kilogram weight. Every time. All day. Modern suits get around this with convoluted joints and restraint cables, an arrangement that holds the enclosed volume constant through the bend so the gas does not care. The Bakut had none of that, so he was stuck. Outside, on a tether, in a suit that would not fold, in front of a hatch that was too small. And the reason nobody had anticipated this is worth stating, because it was not stupidity. It was the limit of what could be tested at the time. There was no vacuum chamber large enough to put a fully suited man through a complete airlock cycle. So the training had been done aboard an aircraft flying parabolic arcs, which buys you 25 or 30 seconds of weightlessness at a stretch and tells you nothing whatsoever about vacuum. He had practiced the movements weightless, at sea-level pressure, and the suit had behaved perfectly. The one variable that actually mattered, what the garment would do when there was nothing pressing back on it from outside, had never been in the test. He was at the outer end of a fabric tube about 1.2 meters long, roughly the width of his own shoulders when the suit was soft. The rules said feet first, so that once inside he could close the outer hatch behind him without turning around. But feet first required bending, and bending was no longer available, and his air was finite, and the spacecraft was about to enter orbital darkness, and there were minutes in this, not hours. He did not tell the ground. That is the sentence I want you to hold on to. He did not tell the ground, and his reason, which he gave decades later, was practical. Telling them would begin a conversation. The conversation would take time he did not have, and it would be conducted on a channel that was, at that moment, open to the world. So he made a decision alone, at the end of a tether, and he executed it. He reached for the relief valve on his suit and he opened it, and he let his own air out. Follow him through it. The hiss starts. The suit begins, very slowly, to soften. A little movement returning to the elbows first, then the shoulders. He's watching the pressure fall and counting in his own head, because he knows exactly what he is trading. At 40 kilopascals he cannot bend. Somewhere below that he can, and somewhere below that he stops breathing well enough to think, and somewhere in between, nitrogen that has been dissolved in his blood and his tissues, his entire life begins to come out of solution as bubbles, because that is what happens when ambient pressure drops fast. It is the bends, precisely as a diver gets them, running in the opposite direction. He has not pre-breathed oxygen for anything like the time that modern protocols require. He is accepting an unquantified risk of gas bubbles in his joints, his spinal cord, or his brain in order to fit through a door. He takes it down to about 27 kilopascals, well below the design safety floor, and then he goes in head first, which means he is now inside a rigid tube, barely wider than he is, upside down relative to where he needs to be, and in order to close the outer hatch behind him, he has to turn himself completely around inside it. In a suit that still barely bends, with his hands not properly inside his gloves, he did it. And while he did it, something else was happening that nobody had thought to plan for, which is that he was cooking. There is no convection in vacuum. On Earth, when you work hard, you dump heat into the air around you, and the air moves, and it carries the heat away. In vacuum, there is no air to warm and nothing to carry anything anywhere. A suit sheds heat only by radiating it away, which is slow, and by whatever active cooling it carries, and the Bakut's was minimal. So a man doing the hardest physical work of his life inside a sealed, insulated bag had almost nowhere to put the energy he was generating. His core temperature rose by close to 2 degrees Celsius in under 20 minutes. That is the edge of heat stroke. He described sweat pooling and moving inside the suit, sloshing, and enough of it collecting in the helmet to interfere with his vision. Remember that detail, we will need it in 10 minutes. And then he was inside and the hatch was shut, and you would think that was the end of it. It was not close to the end of it. The inner hatch did not seal properly, and the spacecraft's automatic system responded to the pressure reading by pumping in more oxygen, which raised the cabin's oxygen concentration to a level where a single spark would have produced a fire. The same kind of fire that killed the crew of Apollo 1 on a launch pad 2 years later. They watched the gauge climb and could do nothing about it. It eventually stabilized. Then the automatic re-entry system failed. So Leonov and his commander Pavel Belyaev performed the first manual retrofire in the history of spaceflight, orienting the spacecraft by eye through a window, firing the engine on a count, with no computer arbitrating anything. It worked, in the sense that they survived. It did not work in the sense of landing anywhere near where they were supposed to. They came down 386 kilometers off target, in heavy snow, in the forest of the Urals near Perm, in March. They spent 2 nights out there. The capsule was too cold to be much help. Their suits were soaked through from the inside, and there were wolves in the area, and it was the wrong season for wolves in a way that anybody who lives near a forest will understand. A rescue party reached them on skis, could not land a helicopter, and had to cut a clearing in the trees before anyone could be lifted out. The first spacewalk in history is remembered as a triumph. It was a triumph. And the man who performed it very nearly died in an airlock because his clothing obeyed a gas law, then very nearly burned, then very nearly froze. None of which was public. The suit incident was not properly described until the 1990s. For the better part of 30 years, the official story of the first spacewalk was a photograph of a man floating serenely against the curve of the Earth, and a short film that ended without explanation, and nothing else. An entire generation grew up with the triumph, and none of the arithmetic underneath it, which meant that the single most useful engineering lesson of the early 1960s sat unavailable for decades in a country that had every reason to keep it that way. And here is why this sits at number 4 rather than lower down among the lights and the shapes. Nothing was watching him, nothing followed him, nothing knocked, nothing lined up on a crater edge. There was no ambiguity anywhere in this story, no question of misperception, no debate about what he saw. He was completely correct about everything that was happening to him, and the thing that was going to kill him was that gas pushes outward on the container that holds it. That is it. That is the whole mechanism. The ideal gas law in a suit designed in a hurry. The most ordinary physics on this entire list put 150 kilometers above the ground, where a man had 11 minutes to solve it by himself and no way to ask. 60 years on, that problem is still not solved. Today's suits run at about 29.6 kilopascals of pure oxygen, which is remarkably close to the pressure Leonov vented down to in an emergency, and the reason they run that low is the same reason he vented. Higher pressure means safer breathing gas and worse mobility, and the trade has never been broken. Every spacewalk performed today is a compromise between how well you can breathe and how well you can bend, and it is the same compromise, negotiated at the same place on the curve, that Leonov made with a valve in his hand in 1965. The other thing that changed because of him is invisible, and it is why nobody has repeated his particular emergency. Every spacewalk from the International Space Station today is preceded by hours of preparation that has nothing to do with tools or checklists. The crew member breathes pure oxygen at reduced cabin pressure for a long stretch before the hatch opens, specifically to wash the dissolved nitrogen out of their tissues so that dropping to suit pressure cannot produce bubbles. Hours of it, every time, without exception. Leonov accepted that entire risk in about 60 seconds, with his hand on a valve, because the alternative was to stay outside. I want to give him the last word on it, because he was a more interesting man than this story usually allows. He was a painter. He carried coloured pencils and paper on his flights, and on that same mission, days after nearly dying in a tube, he sat down and drew an orbital sunrise, the first artwork ever made in space, by a man whose hands had been outside his own gloves the week before. And 10 years later, in July of 1975, he commanded the Soviet half of the Apollo-Soyuz test project, and floated through a docking adapter to shake hands in orbit with an American commander. That commander was Tom Stafford. The same Tom Stafford who, 6 years earlier, had been sitting behind the moon listening to a whistling sound and wondering whether to mention it. The two halves of this list shook hands with each other, in orbit, in 1975, and neither of them talked publicly about what had happened to them for another 20 years. Number 3 is the other one where the physics was completely ordinary, and where the witness was completely right, and where what nearly killed him was 1.5 liters of water. 44 minutes into a spacewalk, an Italian astronaut named Luca Parmitano felt something cold at the back of his neck. The date is the 16th of July, 2013. He's outside the International Space Station on a task called EVA 23, and it is only the second spacewalk of his life. He is 36 years old, a former test pilot in the Italian Air Force, and the thing he has just noticed is wrong, in a way that takes a second to identify, because it is not the sensation that is alarming, it is the temperature. Sweat is warm, this is cold. He reports it, which is the correct thing to do, and which, given everything we have covered tonight, is worth pausing on for half a second. He tells the ground there is water in his helmet, and then the water keeps coming. Over the following minutes, as much as 1.5 liters of it entered his helmet. Now here is where you need to stop importing your Earth intuitions, because they are going to give you completely the wrong picture, and the correct picture is much worse. On Earth, water in a helmet is unpleasant and not dangerous. It runs downward because gravity pulls it, and it collects at the bottom, around your chin and your collar, and it sits there, and your eyes and your nose and your mouth are above it. That is the entire reason a person can wear a wet helmet on Earth and be merely annoyed. In free fall, there is no downward. There is no bottom of the helmet. There is nowhere for water to collect, because collecting at the lowest point requires there to be a lowest point. So what does it do instead? It obeys the only forces left, which are the forces between its own molecules, and the forces between those molecules and whatever surface they touch. Water is unusually strong at both. Its molecules hydrogen bond to each other with a tenacity that is anomalous for a substance that light, which gives it a surface tension of about 72 millinewtons per meter, high for a liquid at room temperature, high enough that insects can stand on it. That same stickiness is why water beads on a waxed car and climbs up a narrow tube against gravity and holds a soap film together. Take gravity away and that stickiness is not one force among several. It is the only one. There is a number that captures this precisely, and it is called the bond number, the ratio of gravitational forces to surface tension forces on a body of liquid. On Earth, at the scale of a helmet, that ratio is large, gravity dominates completely, and the water falls. In orbit, the effective gravitational term drops to something like 1/1,000,000th of Earth's, and the ratio collapses towards zero, and surface tension wins outright. This is not a small adjustment in behavior. It is a different regime of physics operating on the same substance. So the water does not fall off Luca Parmitano's face. It wets it. It spreads. It forms a continuous adhering film across the inside of the visor, and then across his skin, and it stays exactly where it is, because there is nothing pulling it anywhere and nowhere for it to go. His head has become the surface the water prefers. Shaking does not help. Turning does not help. The film simply reforms. It covered his eyes, and when it covered his eyes, his vision went, not to darkness, but to smeared, refracted, useless light, the way the world looks when you open your eyes underwater in a swimming pool. Then it filled the sponge pads on his earphones, and then his ear canals, and his hearing went with it. He could no longer tell whether the ground was still talking to him. The radio became a sensation rather than a voice, and then it reached his nose. He wrote about this himself afterward, on the European Space Agency's own blog, which was an unusual institutional decision and one I am grateful for, because it means we have a first-person account of this rather than a reconstruction. He describes the exact thought that arrived at that moment, and it is the item on this list at number 3. He realized that if the water reached his mouth, the only air he had left was the air already inside his helmet, not the air in the tanks on his back. Those tanks feed into the helmet through the ventilation inlet, which was the thing filling it with water. The air in the helmet, the volume around his own head, that was the reserve. So now, put yourself where he is, because this is the part that should stay with you. He is blind. He is deaf. He is on the far side of the station from the airlock, alone in the sense that his partner cannot reach him quickly, and the ground cannot reach him at all. There is no procedure for this because nobody had ever imagined it. There was no way to get the water out, no way to open the visor, and even a full emergency repressurization of the airlock takes minutes he is not sure he has. And he gets back. He gets back by touch. He has a safety tether, and a tether has a direction attached to it, and in a universe that has just stopped supplying him with any other directional information, that thin line is the only remaining piece of oriented reality. So he pulls on it, and moves, and pulls again. Reaching for handrails he cannot see, from memory of a structure he has been trained on for years. Somewhere in that transit, the station crossed the Terminator into orbital night, and the world outside went completely dark. It made absolutely no difference to him. His partner Chris Cassidy was ordered back inside as well. The spacewalk was terminated at 1 hour and 32 minutes against a planned 6 hours and 15. Karen Nieberg has described getting to him inside the airlock and pulling the helmet off while the water was still moving across his face in a sheet, still holding its shape, still not falling. Before the cause, I want to spend one more minute on the water itself, because the property that nearly killed him is the same property that makes water the strangest common substance in the universe. Hydrogen bonding is the whole story. A water molecule is bent and slightly lopsided in charge, so each one clings to its neighbours far more strongly than a molecule that small has any right to. That single quirk produces 3 consequences that look completely unrelated until you know where they come from. It is why water has an absurdly high boiling point for its molecular weight. A molecule that light should be a gas at room temperature, and by rights you should be breathing it rather than drinking it. It is why ice floats, because the bonds lock into an open lattice that is less dense than the liquid, which is the reason lakes freeze from the top, and everything living underneath survives the winter. And it is why the surface tension is high enough that 1.5 liters of it will hold itself against a man's face in orbit and refuse to leave. The same molecular stickiness that makes the planet habitable is what tried to drown him, and once you have the bond number in your hand, you start seeing it everywhere on a spacecraft. It is why there are no open cups on the station. Pour water into one and you do not get a drink. You get a wandering sphere that will attach itself to the first surface it touches, which may well be an electrical panel. Every liquid up there lives in a bladder or a bag with a straw. It is why a candle flame in orbit does not have a flame shape at all. On Earth, hot gas is buoyant and rises, and that rising column is what pulls fresh air in at the base and gives a flame its teardrop. Remove buoyancy, and there is no column and no draft. What you get instead is a slow blue sphere, fed only by oxygen wandering in by diffusion, burning cooler and quieter, and lasting far longer than it should. Fire in space is a different hazard from fire on Earth, for the same reason water in space is a different hazard from water on Earth, and both of them come from the same missing term in the same ratio. Now, the cause. The suit's life support pack contains a water separator, a spinning drum that pulls cooling water out of the ventilation gas stream before that gas goes to the helmet. Contamination had blocked the holes in that separator, inorganic material, later traced to residue in the water processing system. So water that should have been separated out was instead driven into the gas flow and blown into his helmet, from the ventilation inlet, which sits at the back of the head, which is why the first thing he felt was cold at the back of his neck. That is the engineering. And now the finding that actually matters, and which is the reason this item ranks where it does. Luca Parmitano had reported water in his helmet on the previous spacewalk. 1 week earlier, a small amount. It had been noticed, and reported, and investigated, and attributed to a leaking drink bag, which is a known, harmless routine thing that happens, and the item had been closed and the crew had been cleared to go outside again. NASA's Mishap Investigation Board did not conclude that the root cause was a blocked separator. The root cause they identified was the failure to recognize the significance of the first event. They described, in the language such boards use, a normalization of a small anomaly. A little water is not a lot of water. A little water has an easy explanation. The easy explanation was accepted and the file was closed. There is the pattern again, and it is the 4th time tonight. Apollo 10 heard something and discussed whether to report it. Apollo 11 saw something and chose not to. Leonov nearly died in an airlock and solved it without telling anybody, because telling them would have started a conversation he did not have time for. And here, the observation was made and reported, and it travelled correctly up the chain, and it was still filed as nothing, which is in some ways the most disturbing version of the failure, because this time the channel worked, and the answer at the other end was don't worry about it. The physics was the mechanism. Surface tension, doing exactly what surface tension does, on a substance that covers 70% of the planet we come from. The organization was the reason. There are 2 pieces of hardware in every American spacesuit today that exist because of this event, and I like them both because they are so completely unglamorous. The first is a helmet absorption pad, which is a sponge fitted at the back of the helmet, sized to soak up a specific quantity of water. The second is a length of tube, routed from the helmet down into the dry lower part of the suit, so that a crew member with a flooded helmet can put their mouth on it and breathe air from a reservoir below the waterline. It is, functionally, a snorkel. The solution to nearly drowning in space is a sponge and a snorkel, and they have been standard equipment ever since. Luca Parmitano went back. In 2019, he returned to the station as commander of Expedition 61 and led the series of spacewalks to repair the alpha magnetic spectrometer, a job that involved cutting and splicing cooling lines on an instrument that had never been designed to be serviced by a human being at all, and which is generally regarded as the most difficult extravehicular work attempted since the Hubble repairs. So that is number 3. Nothing was out there. Nothing was watching. 1.5 liters of ordinary water behaved exactly as physics requires when nothing is pulling it down, and it came closer to killing a man than anything in the vacuum outside ever has. Which brings us to number 2, and number 2 is the reason most people are here. This is the one you came for. It is the most famous frightening sentence in the history of spaceflight. It is the line on the thumbnail, and there is a very good chance you already knew it before you pressed play tonight. So I am going to give it to you properly, in its strongest form, without any sneering, because it deserves a fair hearing before we take it apart. The claim goes like this. On the 20th of July, 1969, during the first moonwalk, the transmission from the lunar surface was lost for about 2 minutes. During that gap, Neil Armstrong switched to a private channel, a medical loop in most versions, and reported to a small number of people at Mission Control that there were craft on the moon with them. Amateur radio operators, with their own VHF receiving equipment, had set themselves up to listen to the astronauts directly, bypassing NASA's broadcast chain, and they caught it. And what they heard was this. These babies are huge, sir. Enormous. Oh God, you wouldn't believe it. I'm telling you there are other spacecraft out there, lined up on the far side of the crater edge. They're on the moon watching us. And then Neil Armstrong never spoke of it again for the rest of his life. That last part is true. He never spoke of it again. He never spoke of it in the first place. Let me take this apart in 2 pieces. First, where the sentence came from, which is a genuinely interesting piece of history, and then the physics, which is the part I actually want to give you because it settles the matter without requiring us to accuse a single human being of lying. The trail leads to a magazine called Saga. Saga was a men's adventure magazine, the sort of publication that in the early 1970s ran war stories and hunting features, and increasingly articles about flying saucers. And in its pages, in that period, this account appeared, written by a man named Otto Binder. Now, in every retelling you will ever encounter, Otto Binder is described as a former NASA employee, sometimes a NASA insider, sometimes a NASA engineer. That description is what gives the story its entire weight, because if a NASA insider says NASA covered something up, that is a serious claim from a serious source. Otto Binder did not work for NASA. Otto Binder was a writer. Specifically, he was one of the most prolific comic book writers in American history. He wrote something on the order of 4,000 comic stories. He was a major author on Captain Marvel. He later wrote Superman, and he created Supergirl. He also wrote popular science books, and later in his career a great deal of UFO material. He was by all accounts good at his job. His job was writing things. The spaceflight historian James Oberg, who has spent decades methodically tracing these claims back to their origins, has documented how the NASA insider credential got attached to Binder after the fact. It was not something Binder held. It was something the story needed. From Saga, the quote was picked up by Maurice Chatelain, a former contractor engineer who made expansive claims about Apollo communications, and it reached its widest audience through a 1987 book called Above Top Secret by Timothy Good, which repeats it as a report rather than as a verified transmission, and that is the entire provenance. No named radio operator has ever been identified, not one. In more than 50 years, with a story this famous and with every incentive in the world for somebody to produce evidence, no recording has ever surfaced, no log entry, no tape, no name. Which is suggestive, but it is not proof, and I do not want to rest on it. So let us do the physics instead, because the physics is decisive, and it is beautiful, and it is the actual reason I wanted to make this part of the video. Everything that came back from the lunar surface travelled on a system called Unified S-band. The lunar module's downlink was a single carrier at 2,282.5 MHz, and it carried everything at once: voice, telemetry, television, ranging data, and the crew's heart rates, all modulated onto one signal, which was an extraordinary piece of engineering in its own right, and is the story that ought to be famous instead of this one. That carrier was generated by a transmitter, putting out about 20 watts. 20 watts. That is roughly the power draw of 2 decent LED bulbs. That is the entirety of the radio energy leaving the moon. Now that signal has to cross 384,000 kilometers. Radio spreading through empty space obeys an inverse square law, exactly as light does. Double the distance and you quarter the power arriving per unit area. Over 250,000 miles at that frequency, the loss works out to somewhere around 210 decibels. Decibels are a logarithmic scale, and 210 of them is a number that does not really translate into ordinary language, so let me give it to you as a ratio. The signal arriving at the Earth is weaker than the signal that left the Moon by a factor of about 10 to the 21st, a 1 followed by 21 zeros, and we know what actually arrived because the ground stations logged it. At Honeysuckle Creek in Australia, the received S-band signal levels ran between about -150 and -90 dBm. -150 dBm is 10 to the -18 watts, 1 attawatt. I want to make that physical for you, because the number is meaningless otherwise. If you collected power at that rate continuously, and lost none of it, and used every scrap of it to heat water, you would need to run the collection for over 1,000,000 years to boil a single teaspoon. That is the size of the whisper arriving from the moon, and catching it required the largest steerable dishes on the planet, 26-metre antennas at Goldstone in California and at Honeysuckle Creek outside Canberra, and for the critical hours of the moonwalk itself, the 64-metre dish at Parkes in New South Wales. Stand there for a second, because it is one of my favourite scenes in the whole of spaceflight. Parkes, the 20th of July 1969, a 64-metre dish in a paddock in rural Australia. And minutes before the moonwalk begins, a squall arrives. Winds over 100 kilometres an hour, hitting the dish broadside, driving it well past its safe operating limits. The tower is groaning, the staff can hear the structure loading, and the director keeps it tracking anyway, because the alternative is that the world does not see this. Parkes held. And the television pictures that most of the planet watched, of a man stepping onto another world, came down through that dish while it was being physically abused by the weather. That is what it took. A 64-metre parabolic reflector, tipped past its wind limit to hear 1 attawatt, and now the sentence that ends the story: ham radio operators, with their own VHF receiving facilities, that bypassed NASA's broadcasting outlets. Apollo did use VHF. That part is accurate, and it is where the story gets its plausibility. But look at what the VHF was for. On the surface, the suits talk to each other, and to the lunar module on VHF, at around 259.7 and 296.8 MHz. Range, a few hundred meters. Power, a fraction of a watt. And separately, the two spacecraft used VHF to range against each other in lunar orbit, which is the interference we discussed in the last part. The surface VHF audio never went to Earth as VHF. It went to the lunar module, and the lunar module retransmitted it on S-band through a steerable high-gain dish on 20 watts to be caught by the biggest antennas humanity owned. There was no VHF link from the moon to the Earth. There could not be. A man in his back garden with a VHF receiver was not going to hear a few hundred milliwatts of suit radio from 250,000 miles away. The link budget is not close. It is not a matter of having very good equipment, or being unusually lucky or living somewhere quiet. It is off by so many orders of magnitude that the question does not arise. Radio is arithmetic, not opinion. You put in the transmit power, the antenna gains, the distance and the frequency, and the answer comes out, and the answer here says no. As for the 2-minute gap, the air-to-ground audio and transcripts for the entire moonwalk are continuous, archived and public. They have been for decades, and the signal strength records from the ground stations were logged the whole time, and they show no gap corresponding to the alleged blackout. Amateur radio operators genuinely did receive Apollo, by the way, and I do not want to take that away from them because it is a lovely story. Serious amateurs with home-built S-band equipment and dishes in their gardens tracked the missions and pulled signal down. It was an impressive feat, and some of them wrote it up. And what they heard matched the public record exactly, because there was nothing else there to hear. 2 more pieces of the story deserve answering because they always arrive together with it. The first is the private medical channel. The biomedical telemetry was real. The crew wore sensors, and heart rate and respiration and body temperature came down continuously, and flight surgeons watched them. But that data was not a private voice loop. It was a sub-carrier, riding on the same S-band downlink as everything else, received by the same ground stations that were logging everything else, in the same building, on the same recorders. There was no second path. The architecture that makes Apollo's communication so impressive is precisely that it was all one signal, which means there was nowhere in it to hide a conversation. The second is the missing tapes, which are real and which are far more boring than the story requires. The original slow-scan telemetry recordings of the moonwalk, the highest quality version of that video that ever existed, were reused in the 1980s during a magnetic tape shortage because nobody thought to mark them as historically irreplaceable, and the footage had already been broadcast. It is a genuine and slightly heartbreaking act of institutional carelessness. But nothing about the content was lost. The moonwalk survives in the converted broadcast recordings that the world watched at the time. What was lost was image quality, not information. And there is a broader point that the 2 big Apollo conspiracy claims never seem to notice about each other. One says the landings were faked. The other says the landings happened and encountered alien craft that were covered up. Those cannot both be true, and in fact each one is fatal to the other. Beyond that, the signals were received by facilities in Australia and in Spain that were not under American control, staffed by people who did not work for NASA and who could see exactly where their dishes were pointing and what was coming down them. And Apollo 11, 14 and 15 left retroreflector arrays on the surface, which observatories in several countries still bounce lasers off today, more than 50 years later, to measure the distance to the moon to within a few centimeters. Anybody with a suitable telescope and laser can check. Armstrong himself never made the claim. He was famously reticent, a man who declined most interviews and who spent 40 years not embroidering anything about the flight, and when this subject came up he never endorsed it. The people who knew him best have consistently described the story as an invention, so that is number 2. The most frightening sentence in the history of spaceflight was written on a typewriter by a man who created Supergirl for a magazine that sat next to the fishing weeklies. And I want to be careful here, because it would be easy to end the part on that note, and it would be slightly dishonest since there is a residue. There is a true thing underneath the false one, and it is worth having. Apollo 11 did see something they could not identify. On the way out to the moon, the crew spotted an object that appeared to be travelling alongside them, tumbling slowly. They watched it through the sextant. They described it variously as L-shaped and as looking like an open book. Collins, Aldrin and Armstrong discussed it among themselves and then made a decision. They did not report it in real time. Same instinct. Same reason. Buzz Aldrin has been explicit about it since. They were 3 days from the most scrutinized landing in human history, and radioing home to say we are being followed by something was not a conversation any of them wanted on the record. They asked an oblique question instead. They asked Mission Control how far away the SVB stage was, which was their way of checking a hypothesis without stating it. And that hypothesis is almost certainly the answer. When the spacecraft separated from the upper stage, 4 panels of the adapter shroud were jettisoned. Those panels were large, flat, irregular, and they had been thrown off with a small relative velocity, which, as we established at number 8, means they were still travelling on essentially the same trajectory, a few tens of kilometres away, tumbling, catching the sunlight, for as long as anybody cared to look. An object with no fixed size, at an unknown range, tumbling, in a place where human depth perception does not function. Everything we covered in parts 3 and 4, all at once. So the crew of Apollo 11 did see something unidentified, and they did decide not to say so at the time, and both of those things are true, and neither of them is what the famous quote claims. That is why this story will not die. It is not a lie built out of nothing. It is a lie wrapped around a small true thing, which is the only kind that ever really works. And now we go to number 1. And I need to change the tone before we do, because everything up to this point has been, in some sense, entertainment. Lights and shapes and sounds. Things people thought they saw. Number 1 is not that. Number 1 has no ambiguity in it anywhere. Every item so far has been, at bottom, about perception. What somebody saw or heard or thought they heard, and whether the universe was doing something strange behind it. Number 1 is not about perception. Nothing was misidentified. Nothing was ambiguous. There is no question about what anybody's senses were doing. Everyone involved knew exactly what was going to happen, in writing, in advance, and then it happened, on schedule, in front of them. The year is 1967, and the Soviet space program is under a kind of pressure that is difficult to convey now. The Americans are moving, Gemini has finished, Apollo is building, and the 50th anniversary of the October Revolution is coming in November, and somebody very senior wants something spectacular to mark it. The vehicle they intend to fly is Soyuz, and Soyuz is new. It had been tested 3 times without a crew aboard. All 3 of those flights had failed, not partially. The first suffered a service module failure and had to be destroyed. The second had its escape system fire on the pad, and the pad burned. The third came down through the atmosphere with a burn-through in its heat shield and sank through the ice of a frozen lake. 3 for 3. Against that record, according to accounts given later by cosmonauts who were there and by Russian journalists who worked the story afterward, the engineering staff compiled a list of faults in the spacecraft and passed it upward. The figure that is always quoted is 203. 203 structural and design problems written down in a document and handed to people with the authority to stop the flight. I have to flag that number honestly. It is repeated everywhere. It is sourced to a small number of second-hand accounts, and it has never been established from a primary archival document that anyone has published. It may well be accurate. I am giving it to you as reported, because that is what it is. Whatever the exact count, the substance is not disputed by anybody. The people who built the vehicle believed it was not ready. That belief was communicated, it went up, and it stopped. The man who was going to fly it was Vladimir Komarov. He was 40 years old. He was an aeronautical engineer, which was unusual in the cosmonaut group and matters here, because it meant that when he read what the engineers had written, he was equipped to understand exactly what it meant. He had already flown once, commanding Voskhod 1 in October of 1964, the first spaceflight to carry more than one person, achieved by removing the ejection seats and flying 3 men without pressure suits, because 3 men in pressure suits would not fit. His backup was Yuri Gagarin. That is the fact this entire item turns on. The backup pilot for Soyuz 1 was the first human being to go into space, the most recognizable man in the Soviet Union, a walking piece of state property whom the leadership had been reluctant to let fly again at all. And the account given by people who knew both men, and which has been repeated by Russian sources for decades, is this. Komarov understood he would probably not come back, and he refused to withdraw, because if he withdrew, the flight would not be cancelled. The flight would go ahead with Gagarin in the seat. I want to give that a moment, because it is not a small thing. Take everything from the last 10 minutes and set it aside. No lights, no shapes, nothing following anybody. Just a man packing for a flight that people he trusts have told him will probably kill him, and going anyway, specifically so that his friend would not have to. He launched on the 23rd of April, 1967. The failures started almost immediately. One of the 2 solar panels did not deploy, which left the spacecraft running at roughly half power, with a slow drain toward the point where the systems would begin shutting themselves down. The failed panel also blocked some of the sensors. The solar stellar attitude sensor was obscured, and then the ion flow orientation system failed, which meant the automatic system could no longer work out which way the spacecraft was pointing. So Komarov spent most of his flight fighting the vehicle, trying to hold an attitude manually, in a spacecraft that was slowly losing electricity, with a power budget that would not survive many more orbits. The planned rendezvous mission, in which a second Soyuz would launch and dock with him and exchange crew members, was cancelled, and that cancellation almost certainly saved 3 more lives, because the second vehicle had the same faults. On the 19th orbit, the decision was made to bring him down, and here is the part that makes the ending so much worse than it needed to be. He did it. He performed a manual orientation, without working sensors, in a half-powered spacecraft, and fired the retro-rockets at the right moment on the right vector. It worked. He came through re-entry, peak heating on the ablative shield in the region of 1600 degrees Celsius, deceleration loads in the range of 8 to 9 times his own body weight on a steep ballistic profile, and he flew it, and he survived it. He was through the hardest part, He was in the atmosphere, slowing down, over the steppe near Orenburg with the ground coming up. Then the parachute failed. The drogue came out and held, which is what it is supposed to do. The main canopy did not leave its container. The most widely accepted explanation is that the container had been manufactured improperly, so that the canopy could not be pulled clear against the pressure. The reserve parachute was deployed, and it came out, and it fouled on the lines of the drogue that was still trailing above it, and it never inflated. So now do the arithmetic with me, because the arithmetic is the item. A descent module with no working canopy is simply a falling object at terminal velocity, which is the speed at which air resistance balances weight. The Soyuz descent module masses somewhere around 2,800 kilograms, with a frontal area of about 4 square meters. Put those numbers into the dense air near the ground, and terminal velocity comes out somewhere in the range of 40 to 50 meters per second. Call it 150 kilometers an hour, about 90 miles an hour, straight down. With the main canopy open, it would have been about 6 or 7 meters per second. And a meter above the ground, the soft landing retro rockets would have fired and brought that down to 2 or 3, which is a firm arrival and nothing more. 40 against 6. The entire margin between a man walking away from that field and what actually happened was a factor of roughly 15 in one number. And that factor lived inside a piece of fabric in a container that had been made wrong. Stay in the capsule for a moment, because this is the last thing on the list and it deserves to be seen rather than summarized. The re-entry is over, the plasma has gone, the window, if he is looking at it, shows sky rather than fire. He has flown the hardest sequence of his life and he has flown it well, and there is a specific quality to the minutes after you have solved a problem, when the adrenaline is still there and the task is finished and the machine is just doing the last simple thing on its own. The drogue comes out. He feels it, a jolt, a slowing, exactly on time, and then the number does not change. The main canopy should be out by now. The deceleration should be arriving as a firm sustained push into the couch. It does not arrive. The reserve goes, and there is a flutter, and then that number does not change either. He is falling at something like 40 meters per second and the ground is coming, and there is no control input left that does anything, and there is no procedure, and he has perhaps a minute and a half. He knows the physics. He is an aeronautical engineer. He knows precisely what 40 meters per second into step means, better than anyone else in the story, because he can do the arithmetic in his head, and he has just watched the last variable in it go to 0. Whatever he said in that minute and a half, and I will get to what he may or may not have said, he said it knowing. The descent module struck the ground at around 7 in the morning, Moscow time, on the 24th of April 1967. The soft landing rockets, which fire on a signal from a probe beneath the capsule, ignited on impact into a vehicle that was already destroyed. The capsule burned in a field. Vladimir Komarov was the first human being to die during a spaceflight. The Soviet Union chose to hold an open state funeral. A photograph exists of what was recovered. It is public. I am not going to describe it, and I would gently suggest you do not go looking for it tonight, because it is not information. It is just something you will not be able to put down afterwards. It is enough to know that the decision was made to show it, and that people who had signed off on the flight stood in a room and looked at it. Now the quote. Because the reason this item is on a list of things astronauts have said is a set of words, and I have to handle them carefully. The version that circulates is that Komarov, in his final minutes, was screaming, that he cursed the people who had put him in the vehicle, that a United States listening post in Turkey intercepted the transmission, and that among his last words were, "The heat in my capsule is rising. You've killed me." That account reached a wide audience through a book published in 2011 called Starman by Jamie Doran and Piers Bizzoni, which describes him crying in rage and cursing the people who had put him inside a botched spaceship. And it has to be reported honestly, which means saying this. That book has been widely criticized for unreliability in its detail. The transcript of the flight's final communications held in the Russian State Archive does not match the dramatic version. Among the last recorded exchanges is Komarov reporting, flatly and professionally, that he feels excellent and that everything is in order. Some analysts have also questioned whether the listening post in question could have received that transmission at that point in the flight at all, given where the spacecraft was and where the antennas were pointing. There is no publicly available recording. There has never been one. So I am not going to give you the screaming as fact because it probably is not, and because this man deserves better than to be remembered through a sentence somebody may have made up about him. Here is what is not in dispute. A man was placed inside a vehicle that the people who built it believed would kill him. It killed him in almost exactly the manner they had predicted, from a fault of exactly the kind they had listed. He flew the difficult part perfectly and was killed by the easy part, and every single piece of information required to prevent it existed, in writing, in advance, in the hands of people who had the authority to act on it. That is the pattern from earlier tonight, arriving at its end point. Apollo 10 thought about it and said nothing, and it cost 43 years of a tape sitting unlistened to. Leonov solved it himself and said nothing, and it cost 30 years of a lesson going unlearned. Parmitano's report went up the chain correctly and was closed as nothing, and it cost him 90 minutes of blindness in a flooding helmet. Here the observation was complete, correct, written down, and delivered, and the channel stopped. There is one thing I want to end this part on, because otherwise it is unbearable, and because it is the thing that makes his death mean something rather than only hurt. Soyuz was grounded for 18 months. The parachute system was completely redesigned, the container manufacturing process was corrected, and the vehicle that came out the other side of that redesign has now been flying human beings for more than 50 years. It is the longest-serving crewed spacecraft ever built, and for long stretches of the last 2 decades, it was the only way anybody got to the International Space Station at all. Russians, Americans, Europeans, Japanese, all of them riding a design that was fixed because of what happened in that field near Orenburg. Every astronaut who has come home in a Soyuz has come home under a parachute that exists in its current form because of Vladimir Komarov, though I will not pretend the lesson took cleanly, because it did not. 4 years later, in June of 1971, the crew of Soyuz 11, Georgy Dobrovolsky, Vladislav Volkov, and Viktor Patsayev, undocked from the world's first space station after 3 weeks aboard and began their return. During the separation of the modules, a pressure equalization valve opened when it should not have, and the cabin vented a vacuum in under a minute. They were not wearing pressure suits, because 3 men in pressure suits still would not fit. The capsule landed perfectly on its parachute upright, exactly as designed. The recovery team opened the hatch and found all 3 of them dead in their couches. They remain the only human beings to have died above the boundary of space itself, and Yuri Gagarin, the man Komarov would not let take his seat, was dead within a year. In March of 1968, he was killed in a MiG-15 on a routine training flight, in circumstances that were investigated repeatedly and never satisfactorily settled, which is its own small, terrible irony. So let us go back to the sentence on the thumbnail, the one that got you here. They're on the moon watching us. We have established that nobody said it, that it was written for a magazine by a man who created Supergirl, that the ham radio operators do not exist, that the 2-minute gap does not exist, and that the physics forbids the mechanism because 20 watts across 250,000 miles arrives as 1 attowatt, and it took a 64-metre dish in an Australian paddock, tipped past its wind limits in a storm, to catch even that. But I want to give the sentence back to you, because there is a version of it that is completely true, and it is the reason this list ends where it does. On the 24th of April, 1967, somebody was watching. Ground stations across the Soviet Union were watching. A listening post in Turkey was, by most accounts, watching. Engineers who had already written down what was going to go wrong were watching, sitting in rooms with the document, following a telemetry stream that was doing precisely what their own analysis had said it would do. Flight controllers who had authorized the launch were watching. Not one of them was in any doubt about what they were looking at. They were watching us. They always were. And that is the only version of the sentence on this entire list that is definitely, verifiably, on the record true. So, what do you do with the other 9? I think there are 3 honest readings, and I am not going to pick one for you, because I do not think that is my job, and because I think you probably know already which one you find hardest. The first reading is the perceptual one, and it covers most of what we looked at. Every unexplained item on this list is a superb observer operating without the cues their perception was built on. No haze to judge distance by, no horizon they can trust, no stereoscopic range past arm's length, no difference between the ears to build a direction from, no down. The strangeness is not out in the universe at all. It is in the gap between a nervous system that evolved on the floor of an atmosphere and a place that supplies it with nothing to work with. Leroy Chiao's lights, Story Musgrave's snake, Yang Liwei's knocking, the whistling behind the moon. Almost certainly that is what all 4 of them are. The second reading is the institutional one, and it is the one that keeps me up. The frightening pattern was never what people saw, it was what they did about it. 3 men behind the moon debating whether to report a sound. A crew on their way to a landing choosing not to mention an object. A man in an airlock solving a lethal problem alone rather than starting a conversation. A water report filed and cleared and closed a week before it flooded a helmet. A list of 203 faults, going up the chain and stopping. Across 60 years in 2 space programs with opposite ideologies, run by governments that agreed on nothing, the same failure recurs. The observation exists, the channel for it does not. And the third reading is simply that some of it is not explained. Not most of it, not the famous parts, which fall over the moment you look at them, but an object that a surgeon with 6 degrees watched on 2 separate flights and has never been able to match to a piece of hardware. A formation over Germany with multiple pilots and no film. A knocking that 3 crews heard and no published papers accounted for. I think leaving a small number of things genuinely open is more respectable than manufacturing a tidy answer for each of them, and I think you can hold that without believing anything in particular. Here is where I have landed for whatever it is worth. The scariest thing ever said by an astronaut in space was not a report of something outside the window. It never was. Every candidate for that title turned out to be a fishing fleet, or a strip of rubber undulating because vacuum will not damp it, or a joint slipping under 200 degrees of thermal load, or 2 radios beating against each other, or a sentence somebody typed for a magazine. And meanwhile, underneath all of it, the actual danger was a gas law and a suit that would not bend, and 1.5 liters of water that had nothing to fall toward, and a piece of fabric in a container that had been made wrong. The universe was never the problem. The universe up there is indifferent and extremely simple, and it does exactly what the equations say it will do every single time, without malice and without exception. That is the one genuinely reassuring thing in this whole list. What is not simple is us. We selected the most reliable witnesses our species has ever produced. We put them through years of training designed to make their reporting precise. We sent them to the one place almost nobody gets to go. And then, over and over, we made it just slightly costly for them to tell us what they found, and we repeated whichever version we preferred over the version they gave us. Gordon Cooper spent 40 years denying a sighting that is still attached to his name tonight. Neil Armstrong is quoted every day of the week saying something he never said, while the thing he actually did see, an odd tumbling shape on the way out, which he mentioned to nobody, is barely known at all. And in a field near Orenburg, on a spring morning in 1967, a man who understood the arithmetic better than anyone else in the story fell for about 90 seconds, knowing exactly what was going to happen, while the people who had read the fault list listened. There is a small aluminium figure lying on the surface of the moon. It is about 8 centimeters long, and it is meant to represent a person in a spacesuit, and it was left there by the crew of Apollo 15 in 1971, at Hadley Rill, along with a plaque bearing 14 names. The names are the astronauts and cosmonauts who had died by then, listed together, Americans and Soviets on the same small piece of metal at the height of a Cold War, in alphabetical order, with no flags and no nationalities beside them. Komarov is on it. So is Gagarin. So are Dobrovolsky, Volkov and Patsayev, and the crew of Apollo 1, and Ed White, who had been the first American to walk in space and who died on a launch pad in a fire that Leonov's overpressurized cabin had very nearly rehearsed 2 years earlier. 14 people who went, or were going, and did not come back. It is still there tonight, and it will still be there in 100,000 years, because nothing on the moon wears anything away. No wind, no water, nothing falling toward anything. Just a small figure lying in the dust with a list of 14 names beside it. On a world where a signal from a 20-watt transmitter takes 1 1/4 seconds to reach the people who are watching. Sleep well.